Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us at today's webinar. My name is Shelley Goldman. I'm Professor Emerita of Education, Associate Dean for Faculty Affairs at the Graduate School of Education, and a contributing member of the university's Transforming Learning Accelerator. I'm also your host for today's program. As many of you have heard by now, it's a very exciting time for Stanford community. Over the last 4 years, Stanford has been engaged in a long-range plan vision process with the goal to accelerate purposeful impact in the world. Today's program intersects with two initiatives born out of this visioning process, the Sustainability Initiative and the Transforming Learning Accelerator. President Mark Tessier-Levine announced in May 2020 that Stanford is creating a 21st century school to address 21st century challenges, a school focused on climate and sustainability to align the considerable expertise that exists across academic units around knowledge, education, and solutions for the urgent challenges that are facing the planet. In a similar fashion, the Transforming Learning Accelerator is a new initiative about making education more scientific, more learning-centered, and more collaborative. We are making considerable efforts to work across the university and our education ecosystem to combine Stanford's unique strengths in science and the design of usable solutions to help learners thrive wherever they are. Today's presentation on virtual field trips is an example of the next evolution of the interdisciplinary work that many of you know so well and covet from the university. And with all of that, I'll turn it over to our first presenter, Ryan Petterson. Ryan, take it away.
I just want to start a little bit with a quick background. So I'm going to be talking about virtual learning environments, field trips in a COVID and post-COVID world. And as a little bit of a background, in my prior life, that is pre-pandemic, I taught field classes and did administrative work for field programs in Stanford. I had no experience building virtual field trips or virtual online content in any way, shape, or form, but things change. And so this work is through partnerships with Transforming Learning Accelerator, all the people delivering groceries, which have saved my life through all this, and ongoing support from Stanford Earth. So the COVID catalyst, now the now infamous pivot. As somebody that ran field trips almost exclusively, this was a pretty stark transition into everything's now online. And so the entire field sort of community turned to virtual field trips. And the first question there is, well, what is a virtual field trip? It's a great question. And there are a lot of different kinds of virtual field trips that by the pandemic and have been created since then. These are things guided with content embedded, production cost, high production time, and often require a lot of other equipment. What I wanted to create and what the Transforming Learning Accelerator helped me create was something that was much more social interactive. That is synchronous with an instructor or small group, and having an instructor provided content just like the real field sites, letting instructors teach what they want and how they want it. And this also allowed us to focus on and decision making rather than just on transferring facts. And what I ended up building is probably more accurately described as virtual field sites rather than virtual field trips, as the content is not necessarily provided in the trip itself. This is what the virtual field trips look like. And if you had a chance to get in early and play around, this is the virtual field trip that you saw. This is a virtual environment for Jasper Ridge Biological Preserve here on Stanford campus. And I just want to show you some of the features quickly before we start playing around. First off is a map feature that can be zoomed in and out of, and different maps can be added and removed, so you can see where you are and where you're looking. These environments are based on 360 photos, and so you can move around in the environment. And there's lots of content that's built into it. So I want to just show you quickly some of those things. One of which is you can put audio in. And we can move around in this environment by moving to a next node in the tour. And you can also see content like photos. There's some bobcats, Jasper Ridge. You can also put in videos and other things. I also want to show you one of the things that's fantastic that I love about these is drone photographs, and being able to have a 360 view from a drone is a fantastic tool for teaching. But at this point is how are we actually using these in classes and activities? And I think that's the main thing that I'm interested in moving forward is how do we use this tool? So this is another virtual tour that I created that's an overview of some spots in California that showcase some of the geology and ecology of the state. And as you can see, first of all, some of the photography is just beautiful. And so it's fun to just wander around in these. But I want to show you a specific use that is really handy for me. As an instructor of field classes, I spend a lot of time standing on the side of a dirt road, pointing at mountains and saying, look at that brown rock, which never really goes very well because nobody really knows what you're talking about when you're pointing at brown rocks. This is something that actually has always been difficult in the field, but is something that's even easier in a virtual environment. So we can also put in information that shows people exactly what we want them to see in the landscape, and be able to turn it on and off so they can imagine it for themselves. You can also then jump right up next to the rocks too and say, let's now take a close look at this. This happens to be a 635 million year old glacial deposit in Death Valley. And we can look around and look closely. We can zoom in on rocks. And this allows a level of flexibility that is actually really difficult in in-person environments. Some of the other things we can do, I'll showcase. This is a tour that I built for an art installation on campus. And we can add information as well. This is more designed as a self-guided tour, so the information is already built into the tour. And all of this is pretty straightforward to do. But in the end, to me, the most important part of this is activities. And this particular tour here that I'm showing you is a tour that was designed for a specific activity for a group of students to participate in online via Zoom. And this activity is students are supposed to figure out where they are and what they're looking at. And you can see we have removed information that could tell them where they are. And they spend about a half hour wandering through this environment and clues in the landscape and what they're looking at, eventually figure out where they are and what it is they're looking at. And I'm not going to tell you what that is because we may give you the link here and you can try it on your own and see if you can figure out what you're looking at. The last thing, and this is one of the, to me, is near and dear to the programs that I'm running, is that it's not just about replacing academic content or field trips. For me, a lot of these virtual environments are really useful for other purposes. This in particular is a tour of our campsite we use on field trips quite often. And once we get back to in-person classes, this is one of the tools in which I want to reduce the novelty space, reduce the anxiety for students in going into environments that they've never been, particularly for students that may either just be anxious in the environment or choose not to participate in a field trip because they don't really know what they're getting into or feeling comfortable in that environment. So this allows us to look around, understand when we say we're camping, this is what we mean. And to be able to show them around, like that's what an outhouse is. And hopefully that is something that, if only in a small way, can improve a little bit of our, reduce the barriers to entry into field programs. Cue the infomercial montage of spilling milk and hurting your back. Those must be really hard to make. I assure you they're not. They're really fast and easy. All the photography and all the tours that you've looked at, except for the drones, is all from the cell phone. And this allows instructors to create their own virtual experiences rather than relying on those high production value, high production cost virtual field trips that already exist. It allows virtual content that blends with existing course content. You don't have to change your class to fit the content. It leverages instructor expertise. It can be tailored to the student population. It can be made relevant to local social and cultural needs. Take students virtually to places they will go on in-person field trips. And can be done for recent and current events. So how are we going to use these virtual field sites in online courses? One example of this is the course we're planning for the fall with the help of the Transforming Learning Accelerator that will make use of guest lectures and small group activities within the virtual field sites. And students will learn about California and gain a sense of place solely through the virtual environments, which potentially, and we may be doing research on this, is informing new approaches to conservation through the importance of sense of place in that. But what's the long-term value? This is not just a replacement for a field trip. I think a lot of people working on these think of virtual field trips as, okay, that's great, that got us through the pandemic, but now let's go back to in-person. And yes, let's go back to in-person, but I think there's a lot of space for this in terms of you can substitute a single photograph in a lecture or enhance a homework assignment or a lab assignment, addressing certain accessibility needs. I often am in situations where I'm working with the Office of Accessible Education to determine what accommodations a student might need for a field trip. And that would be made a lot easier by being able to show the student where it is that they're actually going and let them decide what accommodations they need rather than me having to decide for them. Also, like I was saying before, reducing the novelty space of fieldwork by familiarizing students with lodgings, campgrounds, living environments, the actual hikes that they're going on. I say that, it's going to be a moderate hike, but students don't necessarily know what a moderate hike means. Also, by moving some of those lectures of just standing at the side of the road, move those into a virtual environment before you go to take more advantage and make more efficient the trips that the time you're actually out in the field. And then also safety issues, pre-trip briefings, trainings, driver orientations, all of those things can be done in a virtual environment and make real in-person field trips even more efficient, not replace them. We're also working in a sort of piloted some student-created virtual field trips, using those as final projects or assessments. There's a lot of space for this, and honestly, right now, you've probably thought of other uses that I haven't thought of, because it's a very versatile tool and being so easy to make them just with a cell phone. And take the photographs with a cell phone and make the tours fairly simply. It allows for a lot of different uses, not just replacing a field trip. And with that, I am going to say thank you and pass the baton on to my colleague, Bryan Brown.
Thank you, Ryan. And I'm deeply disappointed. I just met Ryan recently because we've been aligned intellectually for years now. So I'm truly impressed by their work. And so I'm going to share quickly my screen so we can talk about a different version of virtual field trip, redefining a sense of place. I'm thinking about how we use virtual reality for instructional purposes. I want to start by recognizing that something really profound happened during the pandemic, is that as much as teachers are criticized, they did an incredible job of adapting their expertise to mastering digital tools in a very short window. As they moved forward, one of the things that they had to do was to quickly identify, how do I keep students engaged and make sure that they learn? And so things that I learned from asking teachers, where was your success? One of those things that was in spaces like in the chat, if I were to ask you to share something, think about a modern classroom. Who shares their responses? Generally, if a teacher asks a question, they say, tell me, the 4 types of macromolecules. Only one person generally responds. But in this digital space, the norm became everyone shares their idea. That is an idea that we want to keep, because sharing with anonymity serves as an assessment. It produces a group expectation that we communicate. But in a laboratory setting, teachers have to do something pretty phenomenal, which is to switch to an inverted mode where we prepare students to understand concepts in place online, but they actually engage in labs at home. I did that myself, running a science camp. And so there's a new hybridity that's heading our direction, and digital tools provide something. So a cell phone can be conceived as a wall, keeping people from connection, or it is the ultimate door. It is a microscope. It is a data collection device. It is a model maker. It is a clicker. And so we've been thinking in our lab group about how we can use digital tools as learning devices, but to transcend scale. So here's what I mean. I can look inside of a cell using virtual reality as micro. I can go place to place on a virtual field trip. It is meso. Macro, I can take you out so you can see the scale of things. So as Ryan is talking about understanding the scale of phenomena, macro perspectives are really rich using the digital tools if we think about how to use them appropriately. So virtual tools, they give us context. And so what we're going to show you today is one of the things we really try to do is to talk about issues like climate change, water purity, and then take them to places where this matters. So if I talk about water purity, I want to take you to Flint, Michigan, so you can see inside the water facility and understand what's happening there. The second thing that we can do is add emotive content, connection. And so if we take you to the place in Tanzania, for example, where the Mwekma Mamas are doing reforestation at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro, you get a chance to meet the people and experience how climate change is being enacted by African people in a way that is rooted in understanding how we can plant trees to create change. And so the goal of our project is to create virtual lessons that become tools for action as teachers can take their students places, they can engage in labs in person. And so we're trying to supplement instruction by giving them some scope and some scale. So what can we do? First, we can take students to places and introduce them to phenomena. Second, we can introduce them to the lab details. And so this is something you don't see very often, but we can actually take them to a lab, show them what's happening in the lab, and then reflect that practice in our own. And finally, providing examples of scale so the students can initiate their own work. So I want to make sure that we do one thing and spend some time on just taking a look at some samples. I have to warn you, these are loud on purpose. And so one of the things we're doing in our group is trying to cue a sense of cultural connection. And so we want the music to sound like the music you might listen to. And so for that reason, you're going to hear some loud music. So come with me to a safari in Tanzania. And here's what they're learning, that in Tanzania, the government made intentional decisions to make sure biodiversity was healthy by making sure that no development happened in the land spaces. And so you're able to see lots of different types of animals living very close together because of intentional decisions about biodiversity. So here you go. Welcome to the beautiful nation of Tanzania. Today, you will be visiting two sites. The first is the Tangiri National Reserve. The second is the Ngorongoro Crater Reserve. Pay close attention to the animals you will be seeing. So we're going to run about a minute of this, but what you're able to see, these are designed for 360 cardboard boxes. The images are magnified about 10 times. Tangiri National Park is known as Elephant Heaven. So you won't get too stirred by the movement, but these are 360s, so you can take a look all around. It removes the peripheral vision, so you really get a deeper connection to the locale. Monkeys crossing the road.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Ooh.
All right, so let me give you a second example. This is a reforestation project where they are working with the Seeds and Roots program with Jen Goodall to make sure they're planting more trees to improve oxygen levels at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania. My name is Bryan Brown, and I am coming to you from Mount Kilimanjaro here in the beautiful country of Tanzania on the continent of Africa. And I'm coming on behalf of the Science in the City Research Group to share a little bit today about environmental conservation. Take a look around. We are at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro. The trees here can't quite give you a perception of where we are. We have another 20 to 30,000 feet vertical before we get anywhere near the top of the mountain. It's a beautiful area. But we'll take you a little bit closer to the planting project where they're planting the trees to make sure that they're both planting trees for different types of diversity, and they're making sure they're planting so that they can replant across the base of the mountain range.
We're trying to plant as many trees as we can to have like more trees, which we need. Yeah, because deforestation is a thing. So with the millions of trees that are being cut down, or forest fires or whatever, we're trying to like bring those like tree lives back by planting as many as we can.
The last example is a video taken from a water treatment facility.
In Flint, their water is cleaned in a treatment facility. Take a look around this facility. In Flint, each of the stations of water treatment facilities do different jobs. Take a look at the graphic. Before the water enters a house, the water is filtered in large tanks. The water from the tanks is pumped through pipes throughout the water facility, where it is cleaned through physical and chemical cleaning practices. In the physical cleaning, the water is run through tiny mesh filters that work like
Things
screws.
I wanted to know
The
is
filter
first is
will
we're using
large
children's
particles
voices to
that fall
offer
into our drinking water.
a sense of connection to the
Those
discipline.
larger
Oftentimes our science
particles
videos are voiced with
removed from
British
the water
accents and adults, and so we
and
wanted to
taken
use
away
children
for
as the
recycling.
primary instructional voices. And then you can use
After
layering
the
in digital
physical
world, so we
cleaning,
can add images and
water
2D graphics
experiences
to help students understand
chemical
some of the
cleaning.
benefits of
During this
being involved in a
process,
virtual
water
context.
is
Just to make a couple points. The first is that one of the things we're excited about is to use these virtual field trips as lesson supplements, right? The goal is to reframe local phenomena and engaging in distant science phenomena. So as students are thinking about what they're doing in their classroom context, we can connect them to bigger local issues. They can see how things are done and then assess, do experimentation in their own context. We also want to change students from consumers to producers, right? They can make these videos. And so what we're hoping to do is to shift roles and have students capture local phenomena and create virtual field trips that can be used broadly. And our early evidence indicates that students develop a deeper connection to science by having these virtual experiences. We've engaged in 4 years of research on virtual reality, and we've consistently found shift in students' attitudes towards science. I want you to get an emotive sense of what it feels like. So I want to share one video. This is a quick video of our kids experiencing their first virtual field trip real time. So here's a sense of how it works. So the message is they were deeply engaged, had a great time learning. And what we discovered is in COVID that they didn't need to be in the classroom together to experience these. We run these on either Nearpod or on our own on our own platform. And because of that, students and teachers were able to share these videos real time. So I want to give you a quick sense. What we've done, and thanks to our IT department, Daniel Guimaraes created an incredible website for us. And so what we can do is teachers are able to simply visit our website, click on a lesson, and then you have the virtual reality resources and full lesson plans so that you can design a fully developed and rich educational experience where students can go on these field trips and then engage in their own environmentalist work, create their own experimentation, and apply it across scale. So I want to thank you all for sharing and visiting with us today. And I hope this is the first of many conversations that we can have about using virtual tools to improve education. Feel free to visit our website, scienceinthecity.stanford.edu. We're still piloting these materials, and we hope what we learn in this new hybrid model is that we can use our digital tools to help students get a sense of scale and connectedness that will help them see themselves as scientists, and more importantly, see themselves connected to rich environmental framing. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. That was really inspirational, and I'm really excited about the possibilities from this. First question, both of you mentioned that students could create their own virtual field trips. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about both what they would get from the process of creating them, and then how they might be used once they're created. Bryan, maybe first?
Sure. So I'll say one of the things that happened is we learned how to use virtual reality in the opposite way. And so we didn't start in our lab with the adults making videos. We started with the students at Street Code Academy in East Palo Alto, building virtual experiences. Now, we weren't using them for field trip purposes, but that camp really launched our research. And so there are several softwares. YouTube University can provide all the instruction that they'll need in order to learn how to use it. But it's very easy to do. Camera costs for a VR camera is about $250. So that is the only real challenge at this point. But it is very easy to do. And if you do that, you're ensuring students are telling their story of how the science is impacting their lives. And I think that's exactly where we want to be.
For the stuff that we're working on, the student created content that we're looking at least the ones that we've tested, is students on real field trips taking photos and 360 photos to build a field trip when they come back, with the idea that it is engaging, and they're thinking about the narrative, they're thinking about what information needs to be there, and engaging with the content that they're learning in that in-person class in a different way than they normally would. But honestly, it's really just the beginning. I think there's a lot of possibilities that hinge heavily on what Bryan was talking about students telling their own stories, and both important for them learning how to tell their stories, but also much more engaging because they get to tell their own stories.
Thanks, both of you. So both of you have hit on how important the experience is for students. And so I'm wondering that if you both see the experience of students telling their stories and their own hands-on learning being important, what way does the virtual experience approximate that hands-on experience? And if it doesn't exactly do that, what other affordances does it lend you?
So when you see the kids in the VR world, in this VR experience, they're ecstatic. There's a phrase in science called discovery illusion. So it's this idea that you take Gregor Mendel, and he wasn't just a monk, he was studying biological phenomena. He was the world's greatest geneticist. He didn't just accidentally come across the pea plant and say, okay, I've discovered it, right? He was prepared to see the phenomena. And so we don't, I hate to tell a bad story about me as a teacher, but there's plenty of times as a science teacher, I'm just giving kids phenomena, and they don't see what's happening because I haven't prepared them to see the phenomena. So one of the better benefits of virtual context is that I can now shape how they see the phenomena. So now when they deal with data, when they deal with information, they have a much better understanding of the phenomena itself. So you add context, and you can prepare students for academic envisioning of what they're actually seeing data-wise.
Yeah, I think I'll talk to answer that question, addressing a single, relatively narrow aspect of one that's important for the kind of classes that I tend to teach, which is I think of virtual field trips, or field trips in general, as and this is mostly my experiences at the college level, higher ed, and so it's obviously coloring my view of things. But one of the things, the two types of learning that we try to get on in-person field trips is both the content learning, the facts about what they're doing, the skills that are relevant to their tasks. But then there's also the more generalized learning of observation skills and agency and dealing with adversity and all of those sort of things. I have more interest in that because I tend to teach freshman, sophomore, non-major kind of courses. But so I think there are aspects to virtual field trips that you could do skill sets. I have built things for map reading, for example, which you can do in a virtual environment. But one of the big things for me, and why I think the virtual environments are so much better than a simple photograph showing something, is about student agency. And one of the things that students in the field have a very hard time getting used to is looking for themselves. They're waiting for somebody to point at something and say, that's important. And I think it unfortunately reinforces that when we show a single photograph of what's important in a slideshow and say, this is important. It's great, they learn that fact, but they don't learn the skill of making that decision for themselves on what's important to observe and what's not, and sifting through the massive amount of information that they're faced with. And so putting it in a photosphere is a little less efficient in that we're not directing their attention to the exact point we want, but we're allowing them to look around and marinate in the wider environment and sort of make those decisions for themselves and learn how to observe things and learn how to judge what's the important information.
Shelley, can I add to that? I
Yes,
want to
please.
share my screen and take you back to what I was
Good,
trying to
thank
show
you.
you before. Um, the most important part is the kids. So here's these are kids in the VR. They're putting on their goggles. They are literally now walking into a water filtration plant in Flint, Michigan. This is what they're viewing. And here, just listen to their reaction. Okay. We're having a good time, that's for sure. But here's what we're problematizing. They're understanding that it's not that there's not water treatment facilities there. They're learning about the difference between physical and chemical cleansing processes, and they're going to actually run their own lab. And so the lab is about the difference between trying to clean water through physical principles and chemical principles. Now, what I provided for them, and this is where scale matters, is a context for how important this phenomena is in the lived reality. So I can talk about it, but putting the goggles on creates an entirely different set of social emotional connectedness, as scholars talk about, Nicole or Juan, a sense of place for a place that they're not even in. And then what we asked them to do is to talk about local issues. And so there was a water purity issue in Oakland, California. And so their assessment is now, let's talk about what we might do to make sure this doesn't happen in a local context. And so one of the benefits of this hybridity is we can use our digital tools to really prepare students to get a sense of the scale of phenomena, connect to the people and locations so that they can do the work themselves.
I love that idea that students can connect to a sense of place, but they can also connect these issues back to what they're doing in their local communities. We have a couple of questions that are about kind of spurring students on to have interests in science and to be excited about it. And when you look at those children in the K-12 classroom, you could just hear that excitement. And so could each of you speak to how you see this as being an open door for more kids to start participating in science, both at the, Bryan maybe at the K-12 level, and then Ryan maybe at the higher ed level?
Well, you got to start at K-12 because you're moving your way up through the education, right?
Okay. Well, I think what I like about the virtual opportunities is that we're framing existing norms for students. And so I mentioned kind of in passing that one of the things that we're most explicitly and intentionally trying to do is embed cultural dynamics and connectedness. So there was music there, the voiceovers by children. We're trying to communicate that in our video, by the choices of how we've designed it, that you're supposed to be a scientist and people like you are involved in science immediately. So that's one of the things that we're doing. But when you connect lesson design to actually speaking to community issues and addressing phenomena and talking about, so for example, in the biodiversity lesson, we have the students come back and assess their own biodiversity. How can you improve the biodiversity at their school site in the local context? Is we want to send a message early on that we need you to participate in science. And the need is also associated with these virtual experiences. So we have had mixed results in learning. So they haven't learned better than other students. They've learned better than other students in their demographic. And so our learning outcomes are sort of mixed. But in every case, we've found statistically significant shifts in students' attitudes towards science. So they've consistently found these experiences rich in helping them see themselves as members of the scientific community.
So the perspective that I've been working towards is mostly around field science, not science in general for higher ed. And so I think the ways in which this is helping in that regard, or I hope that it helps because we're not back to real in person yet, is addressing some of the barriers to entry. And I mentioned this a little bit in terms of making virtual field trips for campgrounds and things like that. And I think my hope is that because these are easier to make, and I've already made probably 50 or 60 of these for a lot of the spots we normally go on field trips, is to be able to give that to students, not just before they go, but before they actually commit to signing up for the class. Let them look around at those environments, let them be more comfortable. I think there's a lot of, we do have ongoing and will continue to have ongoing issues, students not feeling welcome in that space, not feeling like they belong, not knowing what they're getting into. And honestly, I don't have any research showing this, but my hope is that we can use this as a tool to decrease some of that anxiety make people feel a little bit more comfortable going into that space because they've looked around a little bit, because they've learned something about it before they're there. It's obviously not going to be everything, but my hope is that it moves the needle a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you both for that. I'm going to just skip over to a couple of technical questions that people have just for a couple of minutes, and then we'll get back to some more about maybe the research ideas behind some of what you're working on. So there are some questions. Richard Navarro asks, have you tried using Oculus or other VR headsets for your VR tours? And other people are, we'll start with that one and then move on from there.
Yes, I think Richard, hi, first of all. And I think one of the challenges is those are real high end. And so I'm trying to make our work as accessible as possible. And if we can make the VR cell phone accessible, then you've made it as accessible as you can, because people don't throw away cell phones. They tend to pass them on to their children. So in a few years, smartphone technology will be in the hands of every learner. And so our goal is to make it as simple and turnkey as possible. So I've avoided Oculus just because of the cost.
We sort of similarly, for the virtual tours that I was building, came to similar conclusions in that the higher end tools are not terribly relevant for even at a college class. They're pretty expensive and specialty courses only. But the other part that for us, although the tours will actually function in Google Cardboard or Oculus, like if you throw them into that, there's a button and it'll work for that. But a lot of how I'm thinking of, and the with help from the Transforming Learning Accelerator, thinking about how to make the experiences social and interactive with other people. And a lot of the learning that we're trying to get at is about that social engagement, either with an instructor, with their peers, for motivation, for reinforcing learning, for all kinds of teamwork, problem solving. And the VR options limit that. Eventually, the technology will be such that you can be in a virtual reality space together. Probably it's there somewhere, but it's not accessible at this point. And so for us, a lot of it is about being ready for that transition by making tours that can do that, that can be seen in Google Cardboard or Oculus or something like that, but is not dependent on that at this point.
I hear you both saying that it's pretty, that part of the goal is making this incredibly ubiquitous and accessible, and that the mobile phone is probably the best tool for that. We have a couple of questions, though, that make me think, and we understand why you might reject a technology like Oculus, which is slightly more expensive and harder for schools to get. But we have a question about whether you've had any considerations of integrating additional sensors to add a data dimension to the virtual field trips. And I guess along with that question, how complex do you want these environments to be? And if not complex, why not?
Yeah, so for the stuff that I'm building, right now, the goal is not complex, partly because a year ago, I had no idea what I was doing. As soon as the pandemic hit, I started learning some JavaScript with 12-year-olds in an online class, and I wasn't doing very well. And so that's sort of the level that I'm coming at this from. But I think it's also important to think in terms of the level of the user, whether that's the student or, in this case, the instructor that's creating it and using it. And so keeping them simple enough to be adopted, I think, is the main goal from my perspective. And part of that is also that a lot of what I'm doing right now is creating sort of skeletons for other content and working to engage with other instructors, teachers in K-12 schools that have a goal in mind and want to get there. And so for me, it's thinking about, okay, I've created the virtual space. What do you want to get out of it? Because that's where the design choices come into play of how complex it is, what other information, sensors, the other sensors in the field to tell a story. I haven't gotten to that point because that's not usually what I teach, but the tool itself can accommodate a lot of that. It's just a matter of figuring out what story you want to tell and what your learning objectives want.
And from our perspective, The answer is yes and no. I think Ryan has operated with a great deal of wisdom to suggest it's better to understand what the teachers need. And we're not at the point where Ryan's lab is, where he has an extensive variety of lessons and access to sites. We only have 5 fully functional lessons at this point. And so it's better for us to kind of build out greater functionality and resources so that it becomes more useful to more people first. But we're also concurrently working on projects with Light Up IO, which is one of our incredible alums, Josh Chan, where it's augmented reality. So using augmented reality to do something very similar. And with Evan Shea, who's out of Washington, who's also working on smartphone-based VR worlds. And so this is where the entire world is a VR context. So we have some incredible partners who are much better at the technology aspect than I am, but we're still very much in the nascent stages of trying to figure out what works, trying to design something that's effective so we can assess it and share it with people who can use it right away.
And while we're on that point about keeping it accessible, keep it simple, we have a question from Renee Scott about, is it possible to create immersive experiences for very young children and maintain their safety? What's your guess on that?
Yes, I just don't know how. I think if anything's possible. I have very little, well, let me rephrase that. I have no experience with very young children and how to build content for them. The tool is entirely flexible. If they can use a mouse, they can use the content, or if they can put it on in a headset, they can use the content. So yeah, I don't know, something to think about.
So we started with 4th and 5th graders, and our concern was how quickly could they learn the technology. And of course, we found they were quick to master the technology, much faster than we were. So that was not an issue. I don't know what the age threshold is. I think the bigger issue is wireless access. One of our most nightmarish data collections is, as we're running this project, someone crashed into the cellular tower at the school where we were at, and we thought people just fixed them and put them back up. So 6 weeks later, the wireless speed was ratcheted way down. And so part of the other areas of concern are equity of access to wireless. So when I think of age and who can access it, I think kids are getting more and more skilled and greater access to technology earlier. So there's a great deal of flexibility there. I think that my primary concern is for equity's sake, where we're headed with in terms of access to high quality, high speed internet. That is one of the bigger challenges.
So that does bring up the question about live virtual field trips. And we had a question about live virtual field trips versus, I don't know, maybe like non-live canned virtual field trips. So what are your thoughts about that and about having someone live showing people around a site? And this person was wondering, specifically for adult learners, would this be useful? I am bringing this up because of the question of, if you don't have internet bandwidth, it's pretty difficult to do something live, for sure. So what's the advantage and disadvantage of live versus canned and already prepared?
Think, well, first I would start with it. I think there are some gradation within live, in that the live where the person themselves is in the field live streaming from the field is at one far end. There is also live in the sense that you're using static. Like, this is actually mostly what I do, is using the static tours, the photos that have been taken, but I'm live engaging in a Zoom lecture, showing people around, and so can interact with them and ask questions. They're not in the tour by themselves. Right now, we have played around with it a little bit for video, and played around a little bit with live streaming 360 video, and the bandwidth issues are a massive problem. The tech setting it up, it's just a lot of work. It can be done, but my question would be more in the lines of I don't know what values. I don't know that it's currently worth the effort to put it together, but that's probably more of a personal preference than any actual data I have on that.
Yeah, I don't really have a lens on that one. I'm going to leave that one with Ryan.
Okay, so we have a question. I'm going to say it's Richard Neville. I hope I have the name correct.
Neville.
Would Neville, Okay, Richard. Would love to hear both of your thoughts regarding opportunities to embed learning assessment, particularly with respect to virtual field trips. And he says, thank you, both Ryan and Bryan.
Thank you, Richard. I guess the part of that, I'm not sure whether that's using the, I guess there's two ways to go with that, is using the virtual tours and virtual field sites as an assessment themselves. That is to say, students going on a trip, and then after the trip, building a virtual tour of the trip, and that product is the assessment. I mean, assessing that product. So there's something there. I guess then the other one would be somehow having assessment within the tour itself for material that they learned in the tour. And I don't really know the answer to either of those, actually, but I think it's interesting. Like, obviously we've thought about like, well, what does that look like? Because obviously assessment's an important part of this. I have actually gone through the assessment, the aspect of assessment, if this is the question of somebody goes on a real field trip and collects photos and samples and whatever else while they're there, and then puts it together at the end into a tour. And that has worked. That's actually in progress. Just finished a collaboration with the University of Idaho on that yesterday, and they're now going to. At least the feedback I've gotten so far is that students really liked it, because the process of creating the virtual tour kind of forced them to actually think through the entire narrative and create this narrative at the end, which was in itself an assessment of what they learned on the field trip. So it's not just looking at their notes from the field trip from their notes. They actually have to now sort of churn through and analyze those things that they saw and that they experienced and they took photographs of. And in order to put it into a narrative, they have to understand it a little bit better. So that's one aspect. I don't know if that's the question Richard was asking.
In one of our lessons on food chains, we took students into a virtual lab and they had 3 images. And so when you use cardboard goggles, it's essentially a 10 by 10 screen. So you're magnified 10 times. So it's like you're looking up at the size of a movie screen. And so we had 3 sections. There was A, B, and C. And each of these images was a different type of food energy. So they could see a watermelon decomposing under B. Under A, they could see a plant growing through a time-lapse video. And under C, they could see a whale eating a school of fish. And so the question was, identify what type of food consumption you're seeing in A, B, and C. So they used the goggles to experience the formative assessment, and then they went to the smartphone to put their answers in. And so we tried it in a formative assessment framework, and it seemed to work well. We didn't do this. The study was not about formative assessment, but in our first project, each lesson had 4 VR videos. So we introduced a problem in VR. So whatever the social problem that they were studying was introduced through VR. The lab was no pen and paper lab instructions. The lab instructions, you think of those cooking videos where you see people cooking stuff in bowls. So imagine that. We were doing that. So their lab instructions were given by children in VR, and they had a formative assessment task in VR, and then a final assessment, which are directions for some presentation or task. So we've used it, but we didn't assess the outcome of those assessments. We just embedded them in our lessons.
Another little assessment, well, I'll just finish that off that we've done. I showed you the virtual tour of the unknown location. Part of that assignment was to have the students, as a group of 5 people, wander through that unknown location and figure out where they were, and then basically create a field guide for that area using online resources. Because part of that activity was getting students to connect what they're observing with online information, and then online information with what they're observing, and go back and forth. And as part of the assessment, sort of loosely speaking, of that was they created using Google Jamboard, they created a field guide for that location. They did it collaboratively, because everything we're trying to do is about sort of that social collaborative aspect. And so collaboratively on Jamboard, they created a field guide for the location, and they were all great, and the students seemed to like it a lot.
So I guess there's a balance that you choose between how much curriculum you create around any field trip, or whether you just give people raw experiences of place. And so I think it's interesting and brings up a lot of questions. The more, I would assume, the more curriculum that you include the more production time it takes, the more intense you have to work on something. What's the pros and cons of that?
For us, I think that it's always going to come back to what are the goals of the particular instructor. What do you want to get out of it? I think also it depends on the degree to which you want to have, like, for example, one of the sort of bare bones virtual field sites that I'm building, if I'm going to be the one teaching, I don't need any content in there. I'm going to do all the talking and point at stuff. Sometimes I'll have labels so that I can make it clear, like, this is what I'm trying to explain to you, like the geology pop-up. But I think there's also room for then tours that are that the activity that they want the students to have may be social and interactive between students, but there's not necessarily an instructor there with them. This might be a lab assignment that you have students go and do on their own. And there you're going to need more content so that they instructions and information that's embedded in it. And honestly, the actual creating the tours and that the extra labor of creating something that's a little more complicated is not that much. The main thing is that but where it gets more complicated is, how do we actually create that narrative? What's the flow? Where do we want to put this picture? How do we set up this exercise? What instructions do we give students? And this is actually one of the things that people have asked us before, is, how has the Transform Learning Accelerator really helped you out? And this is one that, like, I'm building a lot of tours entirely on my own. That's not the hard part. The part that the TLA has been extraordinarily helpful with is sitting down and thinking about the pedagogy of, like, okay, well, how do we actually frame this exercise? Let's do user tests to get feedback on this. Let's think about, like, what assessments we're going to do. Like, all of the how we use the tool is far more time consuming and important than just building the virtual tour, which at this point has gotten really fast and really quick. Take the photos in an afternoon, post it that night, you're off to the races. But that's just the beginning of good education. It's like saying, I've got a good list of facts, but that's insufficient for teaching. The hard and time-consuming part's the other.
I think Ryan hit it right on the head. It's really about what the teachers need, whoever the instructor is, what they're going to do with their lesson, because we want to meet the needs of that particular group of kids. And so what we do, I think, when we build things for middle school and elementary school teachers, we try to provide more context details just to make it as easy for them. But then when we work with high school teachers, they really take more authority in designing the explicit nature of the lesson themselves. But I think where you want to fail is providing too many resources so that people can customize it according to their need. And so that's ultimately our goal. So on our website, there's always a lesson, there's a full lesson plan, and the videos to be used independently, so they have that option.
Okay, I'm going to just ask one more question because we only have time for one more. There was a question, a quick one, about have you tried gamified elements? And you could just give a quick yes, no, not yet to that. Any gamification inside the lessons or the field trips themselves?
Not really. We've looked at it, but haven't done much.
Okay. Thank you. And then one last question that's coming from Laura. Can you envision using virtual field trips as an opportunity for cultural exchange? For example, students in two different communities visiting one another's communities or field sites and then debriefing afterward, perhaps with the vision of visiting a third community or field site together or in tandem to further their school's new relationship?
Yes, absolutely. We've already talked about that within the TLA group, about having sort of pen pals between different schools of one K-12 school in Maine, creating content and sharing it with someone in Palo Alto and going back and forth. It's definitely on the list. I think it would be a really cool opportunity.
Great idea.
Great. Okay, I am going to ask one more question just because there's 2 minutes. What's your next step in regards to the virtual field trips on the research front?
I'll answer quickly. I'm really interested in sense of place and how sense of place is the sense of place is often, and I'm just at the beginning of sense of place research, so don't ask too many questions yet. But is that it can be used as a predictor for sort of pro-environment, pro-conservation behaviors and thinkings, and it's been used as a marker for that in the past. I would love to take a virtual field, like a virtual class, like the one we're planning for the fall, and look at, can we actually move the needle a little bit on sense of place through an entirely virtual environment? Because that could be sort of revolutionary to conservation if we can actually get people to have pro-conservation behaviors and attitudes without having to actually take them all there and experience it in person. So that could be a really interesting direction.
Thanks. And Bryan?
For us, we want to see if the technology can do what the new generation of science standards are asking teachers to do, which is to have students create models, experiment. So instead of them being passive recipients to this experience, can they touch a button and see, let's see carbon dioxide emissions changed by what they do. So we can go into these worlds and embed experiences that give data. And so we'd love to see a movement from I'm a passive representative in this space to I can actually enact some change in that space because that data will be rich and help teachers kind of teach in the way that we need, which is helping students really touch into experimentation and data collection.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much